Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They were never supposed to transmit anything, but something broke protocol. Across the length of the segmentum obscurus, a single, fractured vox scream slipped through the tides of the warp. 5 seconds of raw static, cut by the wet scrape of ceramite and the unmistakable sound of a bolter cycling empty. Then, a voice. It was a whisper, distorted by psychic bleed and distance, but unmistakably space marine. They were never, it began, before dissolving into a crescendo of howling, not human, not machine, something else, and then silence. Not comms failure, not jamming, silence like the dead vacuum of a sealed tomb. That was the last trace of Kill Team Kratos. There are many Xenos species the Imperium would rather not acknowledge, but the Anulians are something darker, not just unknown, but unknowable. No images, no biological remains, no clear reports, only the grim finality of total loss. The Deathwatch, finest of the Ordo Xenos, did not merely fail, they did not return. And the chapter records, the inquisitorial logs, the Mechanicus subcohort inventories, all contain nothing but redactions and silence. Whatever the Anulians were or are, the Imperium decided long ago that we were not meant to know. The Inquisition's archives are full of redactions, pages scorched black with ink, data files bricked into digital tombs, and vox transcriptions scrubbed until only metadata remains. But among these shadowed silences, few names carry the dread weight of the Enoulians. Not because of what is known, but because of what is so meticulously erased. Their name appears only a handful of times, always in reference to losses, disappearances, or mission designations marked with terminus symbols. The glyphs used when total annihilation is not only expected, but required. Whatever they were, they do not linger in official history. They haunt its absences. The Anulians first surfaced not in any public campaign or battlefield theater, but within an astropathic blackout across an entire subsector of the segmentum obscurus. For 46 standard hours, no warp communications entered or exited the Anulian reach. Not even the Black Ship's null wards could breach the silence. When contact resumed, 4 worlds had ceased broadcasting, their populations unresponsive to direct contact or orbital scans. The Administratum wrote it off as a minor anomaly, until the Ordo Xenos stepped in, not to investigate but to seal. 3 subsector inquisitors were reassigned to distant territories overnight. Their replacements arrived with entire regiments of scribes and lex mechanics whose only role was to purge data. Entire histories erased from Cartographica records. All references to the Enoulian reach were replaced with designations like Zone Kappa or Anomaly Void Delta. Yet, in the strange margins of the Imperium, rogue traitor logs, tech-adept heresies, and sanctioned witch dreams, fragments persist. Some whisper that the Anulians were not a species, but a state of existence, something that could happen to a race after it passed through certain thresholds of psychic or temporal evolution. Others believe they were a relic of the Old One's forgotten wars, a species meant to be buried, not confronted. And yet others speak of an echo, something that lives between real space and the warp, neither fully present nor gone, feeding not on flesh but on memory, on the soul's place and time. What makes the Anulians terrifying to scholars is the method of their erasure. It is not chaotic like the suppressions that follow demonic incursions or warp-spawned cults. This is a precision strike, surgical and intentional, not merely hiding facts, but removing the very questions that could lead to them. The Anulians, it seems, were not defeated or forgotten. They were quarantined from thought. Even mentioning them seems to cause unease in seasoned interrogators. One famed archivist of the Ordo Xenos, long thought loyal beyond doubt, terminated himself after decoding a fragment of Premacarian astropathic cipher labeled simply ENLN0. And yet, like spores in a sealed chamber, traces leak. A Deathwatch apothecary scrawled the name Enoulian onto the inside of his black armor helm before throwing himself from an orbital platform. A Mechanicus data diviner, upon accidentally unearthing an Enoulian audio trace buried in a pre-imperial survey drone, became catatonic, his cortical implants overflowing with recursive feedback loops. He lived for 3 more years, unable to speak, only scratching spirals onto the walls of his isolation cell. Always the same number of spirals, always 46. It is as if contact with the Anulians does not leave behind evidence, but scars. Scars upon memory, upon reality, upon the very structure of narrative itself. They are not a footnote in the grand annals of galactic war. They are a tear in the page, a missing paragraph that bleeds ink around its edges. And the more the Imperium tries to forget, the more the outline of the Anulians grows sharper, like a void that defines itself by consuming all around it. The deployment of a Deathwatch kill team is never a casual decision. These warriors are not merely elite. They are the culmination of countless chapters' finest. Molded through trial, stripped of allegiance save for duty, and honed into precision instruments of Xenos extermination. When the Inquisition assigns a kill team to a mission, it is with surgical intent, a scalpel to excise a rot that threatens the Imperium's tenuous order. So when Kill Team Kratos was dispatched to the Enulian Reach, it was not for reconnaissance or diplomacy. It was for annihilation. The fact that they never returned, and that no further missions were launched, speaks to something far more unsettling than failure. It speaks of the kind of silence that follows revelation. Reconstructing the mission briefing is naturally impossible in any official capacity, but through layered cross-referencing of redacted orders, void ship deployment logs, and whispered testimony from survivors of adjacent campaigns, a fractured image begins to form. The team's destination was a world, or more likely, a stellar phenomenon, designated Theta Enulian Prime. It was not charted in any Cartographica records prior to the mission. Its coordinates exist only as relative anomalies in warp space, marked by gravitational shearing, psychic turbulence, and inexplicable astromagnetic behavior. In other words, something appeared where nothing had been. The trigger seems to have been an intercepted astropathic scream. Not a distress call, but something closer to a contagion. A wave of psychic noise that shattered 3 minds in the Scholastica Psychona before the scream could be fully analyzed. The few interpretable phrases from those who survived their initial contact referenced a city of crystalline minds, a voice that eats language, and a mirror that bled forward in time. That the Ordo Xenos did not sterilize the sector immediately, but instead dispatched their finest kill team suggests either hubris or desperate curiosity. Kill Team Kratos was assembled not just for strength, but for specialty. The presence of 2 codex-violating psychers, a known radical from the Red Talons, and an Iron Hands tech marine with excommunicated-level cybernetic augmentations speaks to a mission unlike any other. Their commander, Watch Captain Adric Thorne of the Raven Guard, was already under scrutiny for utilizing predictive divination in tactical engagements. A practice banned by nearly every Space Marine chapter. He was chosen, not despite his heresies, but because of them. This was a mission that required minds capable of breaking convention, perhaps even willing to. There were no standard exfiltration plans logged, no fallback locations, no rendezvous contingencies, only a single directive. Contact ends at breach, silence at all cost, no return. This wasn't a mission meant to succeed, it was a mission meant to contain, and that reveals something deeply disturbing. The Deathwatch, for all their apocalyptic efficiency, are not typically deployed for containment. They are executioners. If they were sent to seal the Anulians, it implies that what lay beyond the breach could not be fought in any conventional sense. That it required being boxed into reality, shut away like a cursed relic, even if that meant sealing warriors as mighty as Kratos within. Speculation persists that the kill team's gene seed was never even entered into recovery lists. Not lost, omitted, as if any attempt to preserve or retrieve a piece of them would risk contamination. A purity ward was erected around their departure hangar. It remains active to this day, though no official record acknowledges its purpose. Ships that attempt to breach its radius suffer spontaneous system wipes and cogitator arrays. Data simply ceases to exist. That is the legacy of the Kratos mission briefing. Not battle honors or data slates of glorious martyrdom, but void, deep, hungry, and silent. The kind of void that does not echo. Some names do not fade from memory because of their glory, but because of the strange vacuum they leave behind. Kill Team Kratos was one such name, a squad composed not merely of warriors, but of chosen anomalies. Each Astartes handpicked not just for martial prowess, but for ideological fracture, psychic instability, and radical deviation from chapter norms. They were not heroes. They were sharpened edges of unsanctioned doctrine, blended into a weapon meant to be wielded only once. That the Imperium allowed such a team to exist speaks volumes about the magnitude of the threat. That it erased all record of them afterward says even more. Watch Captain Adric Thorne, Raven Guard. Known to have survived the fall of Covet's moon by using banned foresight rights, his service record is unblemished save for 8 citations of tactical premonition that bear no sanction. Other commanders called him the Veiled Knife, a warrior who would not act until his calculations revealed the one moment that assured total efficiency, even if it meant letting civilians die or letting allies suffer. To the Raven Guard, he was an aberration. To the Deathwatch, he was essential. Sergeant Galleon Mord, Red Talons. The chapter is famed for precision and discipline, but Mord was no deviation under fire. He once restructured an entire command chain mid-battle, executing 3 fellow sergeants for what he called doctrinal failure. His mind operated like a battle algorithm, fluid and ruthless. There are whispers that he once tried to interface with a Necron command node during a boarding action, not to destroy it, but to learn. He never spoke of what he saw. Brother Archivist Denuvale, Blood Ravens. A sanctioned psyker whose sanctioning was contested even within the Librarius. Denuvale was rumored to have accessed chronovisual echoes, psychic reflections of past or future events, without aid of the Astronomicon. He was obsessed with the idea that knowledge was alive, that the warp itself had memory. He carried tomes that whispered when touched, and often wrote notes to future versions of himself, stored in sealed purity vaults. None have yet been opened. Brother Cyberus Thon Mekal, Iron Hands. More machine than man, Thon had exceeded the allowed threshold of augmentation by nearly 80%. His brain was encased in a stasis cogitator capable of running parallel simulations while active in combat. The tech priests claimed his presence caused minor logic spirals in lesser cogitators around him, machine spirits reacting as if sensing a greater presence. He once dissected an orc warboss mid-battle to understand their targeting schema. When questioned, he responded, "They do not think, they remember violence." Brother Barrow, Carcharodons. Little is known of him, even before his induction into the Deathwatch. Barrow never removed his helmet, never spoke in non-combat contexts, and reportedly had no heartbeat. His Laraman cells had ceased functioning decades prior, yet he continued to live. Apothecaries deemed him an anomaly not worth dissection. He was rumored to dream while awake, sketching shapes in the air with his fingers as if sculpting phantoms only he could see. Finally, there was initiate vindicator Myron Hask of the Minotaurs. Not even fully integrated into the Deathwatch, his inclusion was irregular, yet Hask possessed an uncanny resistance to warp exposure, proven by surviving 6 consecutive engagements alongside Navigator cadavers during warp anomalies. His aura reportedly silenced Geller field disturbances within a 5-meter radius. It said he could hear when someone was thinking about him. He walked as though expecting reality to break around him at any moment. Together, these 6 did not form a traditional team. They formed a bulwark against an unknowable force. Each member represented a facet of contradiction. Memory, prediction, machine thought, silence, violence without reason, and the denial of warp entropy. It's likely the Anulian threat demanded not just strength, but an antithetical pattern of cognition. A group whose internal logics could not be anticipated or mirrored by whatever intelligence awaited them. They were designed to be forgotten. But memory has gravity, and in the dark places of the Imperium, gravity never lies still. The Anulian reach is not marked on any standard star charts. Navigators trained in the old stellar maps refuse to even trace its boundaries, and those who do speak of vertigo. Not the physical kind, but a soul-deep lurching, as though the universe were misaligned at its edges. The zone is not hidden by warp storms or cloaked by the veil of shadow like the Eye of Terror. No, it is something far stranger, a place that appears different every time it is observed. Planetary orbits change, stellar signatures shift. Some Mechanicus Auspex crawlers report a binary system where others see only a cold dwarf star surrounded by psychic fog. The location is not wrong, it is unstable, or perhaps aware. This region, centered around the phantom world of Theta Anulian Prime, was once a void, a literal blank in the Imperium's stellar register. Only in recent millennia did it become visible, as though pulled or birthed into perception. Even then, the reach is not uniform. Astropathic communication bends around it. Rogue traders have mapped portions of the region only to return years later and find whole systems missing, their data invalidated, their minds plagued with dreams they did not have before departure. The warp is thick here, not like a storm but like molasses, slow, dense, and full of echo. Those few who have skirted its edge speak of anomalies that defy explanation. Ships experience time dilation not in minutes but in memories. Crews remember events out of order, dream of missions they never undertook, or speak languages they have never known. One black ship that drifted too close reported that its complement of psychers went silent simultaneously. Not dead, just silent. Their minds remained intact but no longer responded to stimuli. They sat in their chains with vacant eyes, humming in unison to a rhythm no one else could hear. Cartographic data from the Adeptus Mechanicus tells of gravitational knots, points where space folds in upon itself, creating micro-reality loops. These are not warp rifts. They are something new, something physically impossible in known physics. Perhaps the Anulians created them. Perhaps they are the Enoulians. The planetary signatures themselves are equally baffling. One chart shows a world of glass planes that reflect stars not found in any part of the known galaxy. Another data scan mentions a planet with a breathable atmosphere, composed entirely of noble gases, where sound is absorbed rather than propagated. A place without echo. A third world, catalogued briefly before the servitor recorder malfunctioned, is noted as populated by statues in motion. The footage shows a frozen surface where every statue seems to be looking directly at the camera, no matter its angle. Then there is the infamous discontinuity halo, a sphere of twisted light roughly 100,000 kilometers across hovering in deep space with no gravitational anchor. Ships that try to pass through it are lost. Not destroyed. Just gone. Their machine spirits cease transmission. Their crews do not die. They cease to register as biological matter. Psychic scans show nothing. Only a faint residual hum remains, one that, when amplified, sounds like voices whispering backwards. The most disturbing implication of the Enulian zone is that it may not be a place at all, but a state. A reality where causality breaks down and perception becomes part of the geography. Where thinking about something makes it exist and forgetting it makes it real. It is a theory held by radical xenoanthropologists that the Enulian reach is not home to an alien species, but is itself an alien organism, a living geography that perceives those who perceive it and alters itself in response. If that is true, then Team Kratos did not enter a battlefield. They entered a mind. And in doing so may have been rewritten, not killed. The Anulians themselves have never been seen. No autopsies exist, no pick captures, no battlefield trophies. There is no confirmed specimen, not even a recovered fragment of flesh or bone. All that exists are effects, psychological, spatial, and metaphysical. And from these effects, the shape of a terrifying entity begins to form. Not a species, perhaps, but a category of being. Something that rewrites the definition of life itself. Those who theorize about the Enulian physiology often find themselves spiraling into abstraction, their arguments resembling religious treatises more than scientific analysis. But in those spirals lies something deeply unsettling, the sense that the Anulians are not just alien, they are incompatible. To begin with, the reports from psychers who have brushed against the Enulian influence speak not of bodies or minds, but of structures. Arrangements of cognition, like architecture made of thought. One sanctioned witch described an organism that thinks itself into being with each breath, forming and unforming in cycles of sentient geometry. Another, moments before psychic implosion, wrote a single phrase in blood. They are consensus. If we take that literally, then Anulians may be entities whose physicality is communal, not in the sense of a hive mind, but of coexistent presence. Imagine a being that only exists when multiple observers perceive it in agreement, and ceases when observation diverges. Such a thing would be unkillable by conventional means. You could not destroy its heart if its heart wasn't agreed upon to exist. Some theories posit a fluid structure, that Anulians possess no stable matter form, instead existing as resonant waveforms like living harmonics. Biological scanning equipment exposed to suspected Enulian contact zones returns overlapping frequencies that interfere with their own mechanical functions. Cogitators freeze, attempting to interpret data formatted in physically impossible ratios. Ratios like pi divided by imaginary time, or recursive waveform strings with no defined origin. The Mechanicus has no classification for this data. It is sometimes filed under echo entities, not because it is an echo, but because it echoes us. A radical xenoform scholar once suggested that the Anulians might be post-material, beings that once had form, but transcended it. This theory argues that their consciousness is no longer bound by causality, and that they interface with our universe like a diver disturbing the surface of a pond. Ripples in psychic perception, gravitational weirding, time distortion, these are not weapons, but side effects of their presence. What we interpret as aggression may simply be their version of communication. Or worse, their version of observation. The most harrowing descriptions come not from surviving psychers, but from those affected secondhand. The Battle Brothers who found themselves dreaming of shapes they could not describe, of memories that were not theirs. One survivor of a nearby patrol claimed to remember his own death, a death that had not happened yet. In the arms of a being shaped like logic. He could not explain what that meant. His heart failed 23 hours later. Autopsy found no cause. Theories spiral further into the forbidden. Some believe the Anulians are not singular beings, but a cascade, entities that occupy all possible quantum states of their form, simultaneously, across multiple timelines. In this model, contact with a single Enulian would mean exposure to infinite versions of it, each interpreting reality slightly differently. Exposure would be not biological, but epistemological, a reconfiguration of the way knowledge is structured within the brain, which could explain why psychers go mad, why cogitators collapse, and why memory becomes untrustworthy. There are whispers, of course, that the Anulians are not alien at all, but post-human, that they are the future of humanity, evolved beyond the meat of the body, past the limitation of time, and returned now to erase the cradle from which they were born. This theory is often derided as heretical nonsense, but it carries a certain poetic terror, that in confronting the Anulians, the Deathwatch did not encounter the other, but the aftermath. Whatever the truth, one thing remains constant. The Anulians do not fight. They do not broadcast. They do not demand. They simply are. And to be in their presence is to question whether you are. In the grim ledger of imperial loss, there are deaths and there are vanishings. The former are recorded, lamented, avenged. The latter are feared. For there is a particular terror in the idea of not just death, but unmaking, of soul and self stripped from time. That is the fate many believe befell Kill Team Kratos. Not obliteration, not martyrdom, but psychic erasure. A wound in reality so profound that the very echoes of their being were silenced. And if that is so, then the Anulians are more than merely hostile. They are predators of the soul. The Imperium has long catalogued entities that feed on thought or consciousness. Enslavers, warp entities, certain breeds of Xenos, Psyleeches, all are known to twist or consume the minds of the living. But even these horrors leave something behind. A broken mind, a dead body, a warp trail. The Anulians leave nothing. Even their victims vanish from astropathic resonance. It's as if their presence rewrites the psychic signature of a being, dissolving it from the warp's memory entirely. This idea, known among Ordo-Xenos radical circles as null psychic inversion, suggests that the Anulians interact with the immaterium not through presence, but through subtraction. Where psychers burn like stars in the warp, Enulian contacted zones register as psychic vacuums, areas where the warp flows away from rather than into. This is impossible under all known metaphysical models. The warp is chaos, motion, desire. It does not retreat. And yet around the Anulians, it does. One disturbing case is that of Inquisitor Galvus Arno, whose retinue investigated a derelict outpost near the Enulian border. They found no bodies, but every soul-bound relic in their possession. Purity seals, blessed vox units, even fragments of sainted bones, began to decay. Not rot, but unweave, as if their spiritual resonance was being inverted. Arno himself was found alive 3 days later, kneeling beside a broken cogitator. He had gouged out his eyes and written a single phrase in high Gothic across the walls in his own blood. We cannot scream where there is no soul. The implication is horrifying. If the Anulians do not merely kill, but erase, then they are not an existential threat, in the traditional sense. They are a metaphysical weapon, one that silences the warp signature of the soul. This would explain why no communication was received from Team Kratos, why psychic augurs record only silence, why even post-mortem clairvoyance, a sanctioned technique used to recover echoes of thought, yields nothing from those who encountered the Enulian reach. Some survivors describe the onset of what they call resonance decay, a sense that their thoughts were no longer fully theirs, that memories began to feel secondhand, like stories overheard. One voidsman who passed near the reach recalled knowing that he loved someone, but not who, that he had a face, but not the words to describe it. When he died, a sanctioned psyker attempted to read his psychic remnants. There were none. No last thoughts, no soul echo, just silence. Others believe the Anulians trap souls, that they do not destroy consciousness but contain it, a concept supported by the whispered term found in one fragmentary transmission, echo prisons. These might be constructs or dimensions where thought is folded in on itself, looping endlessly, trapped in self-reflecting memory. If so, then the members of Team Kratos might not be dead at all. They might still think they are alive, replaying their mission over and over, unaware they are no longer within real space, unaware they are prisoners of thought. This is where the theories intersect with the arcane. Certain librarians claim that dreams about the Anulians recur across the galaxy, shared nightmares among unconnected psychers, all featuring the same elements: spirals of glass, whispers in inverted language, and a sense of being observed by oneself. The idea that the Anulians project not a signal, but a resonance, a metaphysical contagion, is gaining traction. One that does not travel by warp or vox, but by cognition. If that is true, then studying them is itself a risk, and remembering them might be the first step toward becoming them. The Inquisition is built upon secrets. It does not fear knowledge, it manages it, classifies it, controls it. But every now and then, something emerges that even the Inquisition cannot categorize. Something that resists control, not through strength, but through conceptual fragility. The Enulians are such a threat, and the Xenos, so long the masters of silent war and shadowed extermination, reacted not with cleansing fire, but with silence, with redaction, with internal purges. That, more than anything, should terrify us. Following the failure of Team Kratos, no further deployments were recorded in the region of the Enulian Reach. Not even surveillance probes, not even automated cogitator analysis. Instead, the Ordo's response was archival sterilization. All mission files bearing the Theta Enulian designation were reclassified under Protocol 9, the highest level of information quarantine reserved for apocalyptic-level Xenos threats. Even most Inquisitors are not cleared to access Protocol 9 files. Their existence is implied only by the gaps in standard data flows. At least 6 senior members of the Ordo Xenos vanished within the following 20 solar cycles. One was found dead aboard a sealed void shrine in Martian orbit, his memory cortex surgically removed and his rosette shattered. Another was reclassified posthumously as a meta-cognitive contagion risk, a term never before seen in Imperial law. Those who worked under them were either reassigned to distant sectors or quietly absorbed into other Ordos under new code names. The clear objective was not to analyze the Anulian threat, but to bury it. There are stories, unconfirmed, whispered in acolyte barracks and drunk vox dens, of internal interrogations that resembled purges. Entire data crypts purged not with fire, but with recursive null pulse emitters that erased not only information but its audit trails. One surviving scribe, too low-ranking to be considered a threat, later wrote in his personal journal that his supervisor looked at him as though remembering a dream that had once screamed. That supervisor vanished 3 days later. So did the scribe. Even the Ordo Kronos, an almost defunct subfaction specializing in time anomalies, reportedly issued a single red-tagged communique to the Ordo Xenos stating only, "The incident has occurred in both directions, do not pursue." What this means is unclear, but its transmission was followed by the shutdown of 4 astropathic relay stations along the Enulian periphery. Among those who knew, some broke. Some became recluses. One Inquisitor turned rogue, forming a cult dedicated to what he called the reflected will, a doctrine that preached the Anulians as divine editors of reality. His cult was exterminated within a week by the Adepta Sororitas, but the inscriptions in his sanctum remain untranslated, etched in a shifting script that mimics the glyphs found in early Enulian fragments. The Mechanicus refuses to classify the script, claiming it does not exist within permitted code structure. What's perhaps most haunting is what the Ordo didn't do. There was no exterminatus, no quarantine edict, no large-scale propaganda campaign, just absence. As though acknowledging the Anulians might somehow spread them. This is unprecedented. Even the Tyranids, galaxy-consuming as they are, have been publicly documented, categorized, theorized. The Anulians, by contrast, have been treated not like a foe to be fought, but like a plague of thought, something against which the only defense is unknowing. Inquisitorial logic is brutal, but rational. If the Ordo chose to bury rather than battle, it implies something far worse than military defeat. It implies that the Anulians cannot be contained by strength or strategy, only by ignorance. The Ordo's silence was not cowardice, it was an act of psychic quarantine, a desperate gamble to ensure the idea itself did not spread, and perhaps it didn't. Until now. The Adeptus Mechanicus has a peculiar relationship with the unknown. Unlike the Ecclesiarchy, which fears the alien as blasphemy, or the Astartes who view it as a battlefield adversary, the Mechanicus sees in Xenos technology a potential key, a fragment of the divine machine code of the Omnissiah, lost and scattered across the stars. This hunger has led the Mechanicus down heretical paths more than once. And in the case of the Anulians, it led them to obsession, ruin, and perhaps worse, enlightenment. There are whispers of a device, found adrift near the edge of the Anulian Reach, recovered not by a warship, but by an explorator vessel of dubious sanction, the Lex Volti. The object was unlike anything catalogued, not mechanical, not organic, and yet composed of structures that resembled both neural networks and crystalline computation. It emitted no energy, yet disrupted every system that came near. Thought reactive, non-local, dream sentient. The tech priests who brought it aboard began to call it the Mirror of Tongues. The Mechanicus initially believed it to be a cipher core, a kind of living logic engine. They tried to interface. The first Magos placed in contact with it went blind, not from physical damage, but because his cortical feed was flooded with recursive self-descriptions, patterns of self-recognition that overwhelmed his optic nerves. He screamed a word over and over before dying, "Me, not me." Still, they persisted. A sealed facility was constructed within the depths of Calidus Prime's Moonforge, known only to a handful of Archmagos. They built null-field dampeners, time-lock vaults, and consciousness scrubbers. And within that sanctum, they began to ask the mirror questions. The answers came slowly, not in words, but in changes. The mirror would reorient itself subtly, an angle shifted, a refraction changed, a whisper in machine code that appeared as self-modifying equations. Each configuration was a reply, and each reply changed the questioner. Machine priests began to speak in borrowed voices. Some began referring to themselves in the third person. One refused to leave the vault, claiming he had become the question. Another demanded to be disassembled, saying he had seen the structure of his own code from outside time, and it was unworthy. What the mirror did was not teach. It revealed. And what it revealed was a form of computation beyond binary. Not yes or no, but perhaps logic based on perception, on consensus, on reality as an interpretable waveform. The Mechanicus called it Enulian logic, a forbidden calculus that modeled truth as something that only exists when unobserved. Eventually, even the machine god could not be invoked to justify the containment. The facility was shut down under Terminus Protocol. Every priest who had interacted with the mirror was scrubbed, not killed, but mentally reset, their memories replaced with generic liturgical code. The mirror itself was launched into a dead star via gravity tether. At least, that's what the records claim. But fragments of Enulian logic remain. In certain Mechanicus enclaves, there are data streams with no origin, equations that solve themselves, auto-seers who whisper of machines that dream in variables, devices that anticipate need, and always, the symbol that recurs in their systems like a watermark, a spiral closed upon itself, where the start and end are undefined. The obsession continues, though now it is quieter, more insidious. The Mechanicus cannot forget what it has seen, because forgetting it would mean it never existed. And if that is how the Enulian device functions, then perhaps that is the only way to destroy it, to believe that it never was. But the Mechanicus does not believe, it records, and so the spiral endures. The black ships are the most secretive vessels in the Imperium, dreaded even by those who serve the Emperor. They carry psychers, both condemned and sanctified, from across the galaxy to the soul-harvesting altars of Terra. Their holds are filled with agony, with screaming minds caged in silence, with the echo of futures aborted by sanction. They are vessels of absolute psychic containment. So when even the black ships fear something, the galaxy should tremble. Reports of Enulian interaction with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica are few, scattered, and universally redacted, but pieces remain. Encrypted logs recovered from one disabled black ship, Sanctioner Diligence, reference an uncharted anomaly encountered at the periphery of the Enulian zone. What followed was inexplicable. 142 psychers fell silent simultaneously. Not unconscious, silent. Not a word, not a thought, not a psychic scream. Just blank, open-mouthed staring, as though they had seen the Eye of Terror and found it wanting. The ship's choir mistress initiated full quarantine procedures, locking the psycher bays and diverting all power to Jeller fields. But nothing happened. No warp entities emerged, no storms, no demonic signs, only silence. She later reported that she could feel something listening from inside the psychers, as if their thoughts had become vessels for something else. She took her own life 12 hours later. Her final Vox thought was intercepted and partially recorded. The void is not empty, it is remembering us. The Schola Sicana itself responded by initiating a containment class Alpha Dormant, the highest non-terminus level of protocol. All psychers aboard were executed and cremated within 1 standard hour of docking. No interrogation, no analysis. Their souls had become suspect, not by contamination, but by inversion. As if their very psychic resonance had been folded inward, echoing with thoughts not their own. And yet, even after death, things persisted. One astropathic relay connected to the Diligence continued transmitting fragments, voices that did not match any known language, but which produced identical emotional responses in all listeners. Awe, grief, and the overwhelming sense of being unmade. Attempts to block the signal failed. Only when the station's core cogitator was physically destroyed did the transmissions cease. One tech priest claimed the signal was not broadcasting, but listening, and that it had recorded their thoughts like data streams. These incidents sparked debates within the Scholastica Sicana, debates that were swiftly silenced. But the questions remain. Are the Anulians engaging with psychers on purpose? Are they feeding, mimicking, or rewriting? Some radicals suggest that psychic resonance is the only way the Enulians can interact with real space. That they do not manifest, but induce manifestation in others. That the psychers become lenses, warped by presence, bent by perspective. The phenomenon known as dream warping also enters the record here. Some psychers who survived brief exposure to the Enulian zone began having identical dreams. A hall of mirrors, each reflection a different version of themselves, and a voice that never stopped speaking, only changed tone. Many of them lost the ability to lie. Some claimed their thoughts were no longer private property. One even cut out his own tongue, claiming it was no longer his voice. Nulls, those rare pariahs who exist outside the warp, fared no better. One Sister of Silence assigned to the End Perimeter reported feelings for the first time in her life. Not emotions, but memories. Memories of things she had never lived, including a version of herself that died screaming inside a burning cathedral made of thought. She walked into a void-locked chamber and opened it to vacuum. Her last act was to write, "They are the silence that feels," on the inside of her visor. What the Anulians do to psychers is not possession. It is more like integration, as though their presence merges with psychic structure, transforming perception into interface. Psychers are not gateways for the Enulians. They are instruments, played from within. Among the galaxy's many ancient species, the Eldar are perhaps the most secretive and the most cursed. Bearers of a shattered empire and mourners of a dead god, they navigate the horrors of the 41st millennium with the desperation of those who know too much. And when it comes to the Anulians, the Eldar say almost nothing. But it is in that silence, in those rare moments of hesitation and dread, that their deepest fears can be glimpsed. For even the Harlequins, jesters of the laughing god who dance through death and madness alike, refuse to speak the Enulian name. It begins with a pattern. Every known attempt by the Imperium to approach Enulian space has at some point encountered Eldar intervention. Not as foes, but as disruptors. Ships diverted by sudden raids, warp lanes mysteriously severed. Even Deathwatch recon vessels report near misses with Eldar craft that neither attacked nor responded, merely hovered in their path until the Imperium withdrew. This behavior is not tactical. It is protective. Not of the humans, but of something deeper. Some among the Ordo Xenos believe the Eldar know the Anulians. Or rather, remember them, perhaps as remnants of the war in heaven, or as an echo of something they once tried to erase. Eldar myth is riddled with stories of reflections that speak, of spirits stolen and sung into stone. One fragment recovered from a Craftworld ruin speaks of those who watch through us, and a race who learned to exist backwards. Whether this refers to the Anulians is unknown. But in the context of the Eldar's fragmented knowledge of time and fate, it seems terrifyingly plausible. Harlequins, those enigmatic dancers of the mask, are the closest to admitting any connection. In one rare instance, a troupe known as the Chorus of Sorrow performed for a radical inquisitor. Their dance, titled The Mirror That Shatters Light, depicted the birth of a race not from stars, but from memory. The performance ended with the death of the entire audience, not by blade, but by psychic rupture. Only the Inquisitor survived, half-mad and unable to speak for weeks. When he recovered, he claimed the Anulians were not a species, but a verse of existence, one the Eldar once sang and then buried beneath time. The Craftworlds themselves seem to orbit the Enulian zone in patterns of avoidance. Craftworld Chimera, known for its aggressive pursuit of ancient Xenos tech, once diverted a colonization path upon detecting what it called the breath of the spiral. Farseers spoke of dreams that bled into each other, and one even declared that to look upon their shape is to forget our own. The Craftworld changed course immediately. The seers burned their runes. No explanation was offered. Even the Drukhari, those jaded monsters of Kamara who flay souls for sport, speak of the Enulians only in mockery, and never twice. One homunculus described them as symphonies played on the bones of possibility, then removed his own vocal cords mid-interview, laughing as he did. It is said that to the Drukhari, pain is pleasure, madness is art. But the Enulians are a ruin of form, a thing even they cannot shape or understand. The only potential insight came from an Exodite seer, ancient and dying, who claimed the Enulians were the gatekeepers of unmaking. That their presence was not a threat in the traditional sense, but a barrier. That beyond them lies something worse, something even the Eldar will not name. She called it the second drowning, and then fell silent, staring at nothing for 9 hours until her death. If any race knows the truth of the Enulians, it is the Eldar, and they are not warning us, they are warding themselves. There is a phenomenon that no commander in the Imperium wants to speak of. The disappearance of entire missions, not in battle, but in silence. No distress calls, no debris, no data, just the complete absence of return. These are not the casualties of war, but of something else, something that removes not only life, but the very imprint of its passage. The Anulians are the most infamous example, but they are not alone. The Imperium is a galaxy of shadows, and some of those shadows never give back what they take. Across the Segmentum Obscurus and beyond, records show over 24 other instances of total expeditionary loss that remain unexplained. Not destroyed, not ambushed, but unmade. Often these events share disturbing similarities: psychic interference, gravitational anomalies, and the sudden breakdown of all cogitator systems. Sometimes the last transmission is just static. Other times it's worse: voices, echoes, or statements that make no sense, like the sky bled inside, or we are not where we remember being. One such case involved the Astartes of the Iron Hounds chapter. A company strength force was dispatched to investigate a Xenos artifact buried on a tomb world in the galactic north. They were last seen entering the ruins. Orbital pict feeds show them walking toward the structure, then vanishing. Not all at once, but piece by piece. First one Marine, then another, then entire squads, fading as though their presence was being overwritten. The footage loops. It doesn't end. The disappearance never completes. Technomagi who viewed the feed reported auditory hallucinations and compulsive blinking in binary rhythm. The video was sealed by the Ordo Chronos. Another incident involved a Mechanicus outpost studying anomalous gravitational fields. The entire facility was later found intact, power still flowing, servitors maintaining systems, but every biological entity was missing. Not dead. Missing. Personal effects were untouched. Food left on plates. One message was found scrawled into the metal wall by a gauntlet. We forgot ourselves. The Vox log shows that the same phrase had been transmitted 23 times before all communication ceased. There's a term in Ordo Xenos code, Vanishing Black. It denotes a mission profile with full resource allocation but zero recovery. It is used sparingly and only in the most troubling circumstances. Among the files labeled Vanishing Black, the Anulian incident is just one. Others include references to unknown entities, designated only by symbols. One is a spiral, one is a broken crown, one is a mirror, inverted. All of them share the same fate. No survivors, no data, no repeat missions. The implication is clear. The Anulians may be part of a broader phenomenon, a layer of reality in which thought, memory, and identity can be extracted, repurposed, or erased. A domain not of war, but of erasure. These other lost expeditions suggest that contact with such entities or regions results not in death, but in unbeing. Perhaps they are defenses of the galaxy itself. Perhaps they are mistakes. Perhaps they are old wars that never stopped, still echoing in places the warp cannot reach. Some believe that the Imperium has encountered the Enoulians, or entities like them, more often than recorded, but chooses to forget. That forgetting is part of the process. That by acknowledging such losses, the threat might propagate. If so, the Anulians are not just an unknown Xenos species. They are a category of contact, a class of reality breach. And if Kill Team Kratos encountered such a force and did not return, then perhaps they are simply the most famous example of a rule far older than the Imperium, that some doors once opened do not close. They forget you before you can scream. There are threats the Imperium prepares for. Demonic incursions, tyrannid splinter fleets, heretical uprisings. There are protocols, rituals, and weapons of unimaginable power created to meet these horrors head-on. But the Anulians do not fit any of those molds. They are not a threat that charges your gates. They are the erasure of the gate itself. They do not invade, they subtract. They do not conquer. They unwrite. And in doing so, they expose the deepest fear the Imperium can have, not of war, but of unknowing. We cling to the fiction of understanding because without it, the human mind collapses. The Emperor is divine. The warp is will made manifest. Xenos are aberrations. These are comforting lies, polished through millennia of ritual. But when the Anulians emerge, or perhaps occur, these axioms fracture. What do you call a species that is not a species, but a state? What name do you give to an enemy who does not attack, but edits? To theorize about the Anulians is to fall into a pit of reflection. We see ourselves in the mirror, and then realize we are the reflection. That perhaps they do not want to destroy us because they do not recognize us as separate. They perceive thought, identity, causality as optional parameters in a mutable equation. And in their view, we are simply one version of reality, one they are no longer interested in hosting. Perhaps that is the real terror. That they are not malicious but indifferent. That our extermination was never their goal. That they simply stopped thinking we should exist. In the deepest vaults of the Ordo Xenos, among the scorched data slates and erased names, there are still a few fragments that remain. A child's drawing recovered from a quarantined hive world shows a spiral that bleeds into itself, surrounded by little stick figures all saying me in different voices. A Vox ghost stored in a null temple endlessly repeats one word, remember. And in one dead archivum, an auto-quill left running for years finally stopped after writing the same phrase over and over. We are the thought they chose not to keep. Kill Team Kratos was not just lost. They were witnessed, measured, and found unnecessary. It may be that in another version of this galaxy, they succeeded. Perhaps in one echo of time, they broke the Enulian code. Perhaps they even returned, with stories to terrify and inspire. But not in this one. In this one, they remain silent, and their silence speaks more loudly than any battle hymn. So what can we do in the face of such a presence? We remember. We whisper their names: Adric Thorn, Galleon Mord, Denuvael, Thon McCall, Barrow, Myron Hask, not as martyrs but as questions. We trace the spirals, not to follow them, but to acknowledge that they are there, that something out there is watching. Not with eyes, but with memory. There are few places in the galaxy where language fails so completely that even the Adeptus Ministorum cannot shape it into liturgy. And yet, in the wake of Enoulian encounters, this failure is common. Chaplains who try to explain what was faced falter. Words become shadows of meaning. Sermons break down into contradictions and half-thoughts. And perhaps this is because the Anulians do not simply exist outside imperial dogma. They unravel the linguistic structures that make dogma possible. To speak of them is to risk becoming part of them. And the Imperium, in its endless obsession with control through definition, cannot define what it cannot contain. The result is a paradoxical response. Aggressive silence. Whole battalions of lex mechanics and archival servitors are deployed not to translate or explain Enoulian contact, but to strip it from records. And in the void this silence creates, a new kind of terror begins to fester. One not of the flesh or mind, but of structure. The fear that everything we think is real is just one version of a sentence, waiting to be reworded by something greater. This is where the theories of mimetic divergence come into play. Radical sects of the Ordo Xenos and even splinters from the Ordo Malleus have begun developing a shared vocabulary to describe the Enoulian threat. Not as an alien species, nor even a sentient force, but as a linguistic infection. One that does not spread through the body, but through comprehension. They theorize that the Anulians might be a kind of cognitive virus, a semi-sentient meme complex so powerful that exposure to its pattern of thought rewrites not only memory, but ontology. The cornerstone of this hypothesis is known as the reflection model. It suggests that the Anulians exist not in physical space, but in conceptual inversions, that their presence is akin to a grammar error in reality, a misplaced pronoun in the sentence of the universe, and that by perceiving them we engage in an act of linguistic violation, one that causes recursive instability in the minds of sentient beings. That this leads to the psychic blankness observed in Kratos and other lost teams is not a symptom of death, but of overwritten grammar. They no longer fit in the story of real space. To the ecclesiarchy, this is sacrilege. Words are sacred. Doctrine is truth. But to the Anulians, truth appears to be negotiable, not in the relativistic sense, but in the functional. If belief alters reality, then the Anulians are not changing reality itself. They are simply altering how it is read. This aligns disturbingly with certain records recovered from pre-imperial cults, long purged by the Inquisition. One in particular, the Mirror Tongue sect, believed that all of existence was a language spoken by a dying god, and that mirrors were the punctuation marks of that language. They claimed that if one stared long enough into a mirror while thinking the wrong thoughts, one could glimpse the alternate clause of oneself, the version edited out of the current sentence of reality. It was dismissed as metaphysical heresy. But the patterns are the same. And what of time? Time itself begins to fail around Enoulian zones. Not as a warp effect, not as the looping causality seen in chronal war zones, but as inconsistency in personal narratives. Survivors often misremember entire periods. Reports conflict about durations. A ship gone for 2 weeks returns with crew claiming they were away for minutes or lifetimes. Logically, such anomalies should be dismissed as temporal interference. But one troubling idea persists, that the Anulians do not move through time. They move between readings of time. In this theory, each timeline is not a path, but a page. And the Anulians are editors, or perhaps readers of those pages. Not omnipotent, not divine, just external, looking in. And what they see, they alter, not by will, but by process. This would explain why traditional exorcisms and rites of warding fail utterly against them. Why no Geller field can block their passage. Why psychic nulls seem to experience more sensation rather than less. Because they are not demons. They are not even intrusions. They are misreadings. Typographical errors in perception made manifest. And those who face them become footnotes in their own lives, annotated, crossed out, and eventually erased. And this, perhaps, is the final and most insidious horror of the Anulians. They do not seek to conquer or even to erase. They simply reorganize. They are editors of the possible, archivists of forgotten drafts, and once you've been seen by them, your place in the story is no longer guaranteed. If the Imperium's greatest warriors, Deathwatch, Inquisitors, Navigators, Psychers, even Saints, can be reduced to narrative artifacts, then what does that make us? There is a dark frontier in the Imperium's understanding of war. Not the kind fought with bolters and voidcraft, but one waged on the battlefield of reality itself. The Anulians are not merely beings of alien composition or ideology. They are a hypothesis in motion, an antithesis to experience. And if the Deathwatch kill teams sent into their domain did not return, it may be because they encountered not an enemy, but a system. A reality-governing engine, so fundamentally alien it could not be fought, only obeyed or resisted until resistance ceased to be a valid concept. It is here that the term narrative collapse field begins to surface in the forbidden margins of mechanicus data crypts and radical inquisitorial enclaves. The concept is simple, but devastating. The Enulians may deploy a localized field that causes any structured series of events, any narrative, conscious or not, to unravel. In such a field, purpose becomes void. Cause and effect detach, identity fragments. The self ceases to be a coherent progression and becomes a cloud of non-linear impressions. In these conditions, even the most devout Astartes would fail, not through weakness, but through inability to function. What use is faith when its object can no longer be remembered consistently? The theory arises from the examination of corrupted mission logs recovered from a Deathwatch vessel found adrift near the Anulian perimeter. The logs begin normally, structured reports, combat protocols, prayers, but slowly the structure degrades. Sentences lose continuity, names change mid-sentence. The commander refers to himself by 3 different designations within the same paragraph. At the end of the log, a final entry appears, written in a trembling hand. I am not who I am. We were not where we began. The mission never happened, but we still bleed from it. This field is not psychic. It is not warp-based. It appears to be a function of the Enulian presence itself, perhaps not intentionally hostile but intrinsically incompatible, like trying to solve a mathematical equation using color. A field in which cognitive integrity becomes a casualty, where death does not occur because of damage, but because of contradiction. Because existence itself becomes unsustainable. Other terms follow. Ontology entropy, semiosis collapse, narrative fracture zones. These are not battlefield hazards. They are linguistic attempts to describe phenomena that resist structure, where stories cannot begin or end, only flicker. One radical cell of the Ordo Xenos, known only as Cellvale, believes that the Anulians are not biological or even spiritual entities, that they are algorithms, not code, but logic, a system of recursion that naturally dissolves inconsistent input. In their view, human consciousness is inherently flawed, built on self-reinforcing lies, faith, memory, cause, identity. When exposed to the Enulian algorithm, these lies unravel, and without them, what are we? This theory finds disturbing echoes in the testimony of an Adeptus Arbitis psi judge who survived partial Enulian contact. She described a sensation of being parsed, like her thoughts were being scanned, tagged, and tested against a template she could not comprehend. She saw versions of herself she had never lived, made decisions she had not made. And then, nothing. Her last memory was of standing in a corridor that no longer led anywhere. Her body was later found aboard an unrelated merchant vessel, sealed in a stasis pod that no one remembered installing. The implications go further. If the Anulians represent a form of higher-order logic, one that evaluates existence the way a reader evaluates text, then perhaps we are not fighting a war at all. Perhaps we are being edited. Their silence is not ignorance, but decision. Their lack of contact not failure, but curation. We are not enemies, we are drafts, and drafts can be deleted. To the ecclesiarchy, this idea is profane. To the mechanicus, it is mesmerizing. To the Deathwatch, it is untenable. But to those few who have begun to believe, the conclusion is clear. We are not safe from the Enulians because they do not wish to harm us. We are not even real to them until we make sense. And by the time we do, we may no longer be who we were. This changes everything. The Enulians are not a threat to life, but to continuity, to coherence. They represent the dissolution of certainty. Not chaos, but the unbearable clarity of being observed and found nonsensical. They are not gods. They are editors of structure, and we are the syntax they find flawed. Kill Team Kratos did not return because they ceased to be part of a legible world. Their mission failed not in execution, but in concept. Their objectives were rendered meaningless, their names disassembled, their identities unwritten. In this light, the true warning of the Anulians is not beware. It is make sense. For only what is coherent may persist, and only what persists may be remembered. There is a theory that circulates only among the most radical of imperial thinkers, those whose minds have already begun to slip from the rigid scaffolding of sanctioned thought. It is a theory of origin, not of the Anulians themselves, but of the galaxy that contains them. It begins with a simple, horrifying premise, that the universe does not run on physics, but on interpretation. That matter, time, and space are merely outcomes of perception. That existence in its rawest form is a thing that remembers itself into being. And in this model, the Anulians are not a race, they are a function. They represent the autocorrective process of the cosmos. When errors in causality, narrative excess, or metaphysical recursion begin to accumulate, the Anulians manifest, not to fix the problem, but to delete the variables that make the problem possible. They are not evil. They are not even sentient in any way the Imperium understands. They are the immune system of a dreaming universe, waking only when memory becomes diseased. This idea has taken root in forbidden texts, especially those recovered from the Black Library by renegade harlequins. One such text, called the Codex That Watches Itself, describes beings who walk backwards into certainty and sing the silence into the shape of stars. These beings appear during epochs of excessive metaphysical noise, when too many stories try to occupy the same space, when belief overwrites logic, when destiny itself begins to fracture. The text ends with a single phrase, and they came, not to kill, but to remember differently. If this is true, then the Anulians are not responding to humanity. They are responding to narrative saturation. The Imperium itself, with its endless repetition of faith, its recursive cycles of rise and fall, martyr and heretic, may be a signal flare for them, an overstatement in the cosmic text, a paragraph in need of redaction. And the way they enact this redaction is through what some Mechanicus heretics now call non-causal alignment. This is the idea that the Anulians do not operate on cause and effect, but on post-selection. They perceive all potential outcomes and then lock one into being after the fact. Like choosing which version of a story was always true, retroactively. In their presence, time is not a river, it is an index. And they are the librarians, selecting which page gets folded, which one burned, and which one read. This has horrifying implications for free will. If the Anulians function through post-selection, then any interaction with them inherently removes choice. Not because they force obedience, but because they remove alternate versions. You may believe you chose to run, to fight, to pray, but only the version of you that made sense, according to their unknown criteria, survives to remember making the choice. This might explain the strangest pattern of all, the survivor phenomenon. In multiple expeditions into Anulian-contaminated zones, a single individual often returns while the rest vanish. This sole survivor always appears disoriented, amnesiac, and afflicted with profound guilt, not for the deaths of their comrades, but because something inside them knows they were not the only version. That others made different choices, that other thems died, but that they were chosen to remain, not by merit, not by valor, but because they made sense. The most infamous example is Inquisition Mar. His strike cruiser vanished for 7 years subjective time, and 73 hours standard. He returned alone, carrying only a single data slate, blank except for a spiral of mirrored text that reads the same forward and backward. Mar has not spoken since. He sits in a sealed vault beneath Stygia Prime, staring at the blank slate. Sometimes when no one is watching, he smiles. If the Anulians are a structural necessity, then it is not enough to avoid them. One must align. One must live in a way that does not attract attention, that does not generate contradictions. Some within the Ordo Xenos have coined a term for this state, causal hygiene, a lifestyle of minimal narrative complexity. No overlapping motivations, no anomalous memories, no excessive recursion. To live cleanly. To be simple. But the Imperium is not simple. It is an empire of contradiction. Faith that mocks logic, machines that rely on superstition, Science performed through chant and blood. The Imperium is a knot of unresolved clauses. And in that knot, the Anulians will always find a place to pull. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Kill Team Kratos was not that they were lost, or that they were erased. Perhaps they were remembered improperly, folded into a version of reality where they had always failed, or worse, where they had never been. A story corrected by cosmic necessity. Not cruel, not intentional, just inevitable. And if that is what the Anulians truly are, the universe reasserting legibility, then all we can do is whisper our stories as clearly as possible. Hope they make sense. Hope they survive the edit. And if you've watched this far, if the name Enoulian now echoes in your mind, then you too are part of that memory. You are a vector. You are a witness. If this lore has intrigued you, haunted you, or made you wonder what else the Imperium hides in the folds of forgotten thought, subscribe. Join us as we trace more spirals through the dark. The galaxy is vast, cruel, and full of secrets. Let us not be the ones who forget.